Okay. Okay, if I can have everyone's attention, please, we're going to begin our next session. For those of you who are in the overflow part of the audience, we have some seats now available. We've been at standing room only in the back. If I can have everyone's attention, please. Again, I'm Steve Clemens with the New America Foundation and the Washington Note. I helped put together the Afghanistan Study Group. There are people that are involved in so many different task forces and study groups that have been involved in this, from the Center for American Progress to the Center for New American Security, the Afghanistan Study Group, and of course the Century Foundation International Task Force on Afghanistan, which received a lot of discussion a moment ago. We now have a fantastic second group to study the question of next steps in Afghanistan. What are the options? I want to say a special greeting to those folks watching online right now and have joined us with C-SPAN, who is taping the entire program today. I want to thank C-SPAN and its many viewers for being with us. Now we have Brian Katulis, who is not only a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He's the author of the book, The Prosperity Agenda, but he's also, I give him credit for what I call the most important strategy in the United States, what he calls the Tom Sawyer strategy, which is trying to figure out how to get other global stakeholders to paint your fence. I'll let him describe what that means. To Brian's left, we have my colleague and great friend Peter Bergen. Of course, we know Peter is the guy who in the 1990s tracked down Osama bin Laden when the CIA couldn't find him, and is really of the bin Laden franchise, of those who watch terrorism, who watch what al-Qaeda is about. Peter is without real rival in my view. He's director of the National Security Studies Program at the New America Foundation, terrorism analyst at CNN, and most recently author of The Longest War, The Enduring Conflict Between America and al-Qaeda, which I highly recommend to folks. Then we have Matthew Ho, who is the director of the Afghanistan Study Group, a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, which is a host and partner with the Afghanistan Study Group, a former State Department official in U.S. Marine in Afghanistan and Iraq, and just a very cool guy besides. And then we have Ambassador James Dobbins. Jim has held almost every great position in government: Assistant Secretary of State, Special Assistant to the President. Whether, he is, of course, one of the people who was pivotal and key in putting together the Bonn agreement in Afghanistan and was the President's special representative in that. But it doesn't matter whether it's Haiti or Bosnia. Jim is really one of the great, America's great global architects. And then we have a great pleasure to moderate this next panel, Susan Glasser, who's editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. I do a lot of global speaking. I also go to places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, Dubuque, Iowa, speak to the Committee on Foreign Relations, hang out with professors. And her recent issue of the 100 top thinkers in the world is invariably sitting on the pile of red, and it's red. It's not just a magazine. People are either leafing through to see if they're in there, and if not, to see how foreign policy, but foreign policy, I think, and I just want to say one word, there are lots of magazines out there, and you get a piece of paper, you see a magazine there. There are very few that I think have picked up, and I say this as sort of a new media guy, who get the importance of networks, and that ideas are, it's not the feeling of a magazine that's just a brick and mortar done on paper, that it is in fact a network of ideas, and the currents running through foreign policy today is what has made it such a nationally acclaimed and highly acclaimed and award receiving magazine. So please welcome Susan Glasser. Yes.
Thank you, Steve, who, of course, in true form has already gone off to organize another panel. I'm sure you'll all be invited to tomorrow. So thank you very much. Although he has stepped out, he has given me strict instructions for this conversation, and so I will do my best to keep us on it. Obviously, there's a lot of the waterfront that we're going to be covering today when it comes to the questions surrounding the war in Afghanistan. But I think the mission of this group is to look specifically at surfacing what are real options, possibilities, and opportunities in this moment when it comes to thinking about the American engagement in Afghanistan, what about negotiations, what's realistic. There's a lot of talk. Some of the clocks are very differently set when it comes to Kabul versus Washington and vice versa, and I think we have pretty much an all-star group of people to help navigate us through, cutting through behind what's rhetoric and what's reality at this moment in time. And I can't think of anyone better to start us off than Ambassador Dobbins, who, as we were just discussing out front, is also in many ways the architect of this, perhaps not entirely wittingly, of this status quo we've been in with President Karzai for the last decade. And I'm hoping he can start us off today by walking through what some of our options are. Thank you.
Thank you. I love being introduced as the man who brought you President Karzai. The American objective in Afghanistan is often stated as preventing that country from becoming a sanctuary for al-Qaeda. I would amend that slightly by saying that we want to prevent the country from becoming a sanctuary for or an ally with al-Qaeda. That was its status prior to 2001. That is, it wasn't simply a sanctuary, it was an ally of al-Qaeda. And that's why it's different from Yemen or Somalia or Pakistan, places with weak governments or no government at all, but not a government that's actively allied with a global terrorist movement. And that's what Afghanistan could become again if the Taliban were able to resume power backed by al-Qaeda, as it is, at least for the moment. Now, the mood in the United States is pretty pessimistic about Afghanistan and our chances of succeeding there, and I think that's to some degree been reflected in today's discussions. Interestingly enough, Afghans have a rather different perception of their future and don't share the pessimism that pervades American opinion. If you ask Afghans whether their country is moving in the right direction, 59% of them say they think it is. That's versus 28% of Americans who have a similar opinion regarding the United States. If you ask them the classic Ronald Reagan question, are you better off today than you were 5 years ago? 63% of Afghans respond, yes, they are better off. This is contrast to a drop of 40% in the U.S. Consumer Confidence Index over the last year. We tend to think of President Karzai as illegitimate, inept, and corrupt. In Afghanistan, he enjoys a 62% personal popularity rating, and rather his government enjoys a 62% approval rating, and he personally has an 82% popularity rating. I imagine most recent American presidents would be very pleased with those kinds of numbers. Support for the U.S. troop presence in the latest polls is at 62% in Afghanistan, which contrasts to 31% support for American troop presence in Afghanistan in American opinion. Now, why are the Afghans so confident? What's going on? Well, I think it's pretty easy to explain. Since 2001, the GDP has gone up 300%. There's 8 million children in school today versus 1 million in 2001, of whom some 2 million are girls. 80% of Afghans now have access to at least some basic health care facilities. Infant mortality is down, longevity is up. Assuming the children who are in school today stay in school, in 10 years Afghanistan's literacy rate will have tripled. And perhaps the most interesting statistic at all, over half the Afghan population now have telephones, whereas virtually none had telephones 9 years ago. Security does continue to deteriorate in Afghanistan, and that's a serious source of concern. The UN said that 2,700 Afghan civilians were killed last year in the war, and that's a number that's up from the previous year. But 2,700, that would be a bad week in Iraq in 2006, not a bad year. And in fact, the Iraqi figures are still higher than they are in Afghanistan. So I think that the Afghans project their future the same way we do. That is, they compare their recent past to their current past, and they project it into the future. And so their life is improved, and they project that in the future. Most Americans feel that their life hasn't improved over the last couple of years, and they're projecting that into the future. And I think that explains why a lot of the debate in this country is not so much over ends and means in Afghanistan or even the prospects for success, but the cost. And the costs are now the dominant factor in addressing the future of American strategy. Now, our theme today is our solutions rather than descriptions of the problem. And I think Tom Pickering in the last panel talked a good deal about the Century Foundation report that he and I and a number of other American and non-American officials were instrumental in putting together, supporting the prospect for a peace negotiation in Afghanistan. I don't want to repeat what Tom had to say. I will note that there is very strong public support throughout Afghan society for some kind of negotiated solution. This support is not reflected in some of the political leadership in Kabul and in the civil society elements of Kabul for obvious reasons, as they're somewhat apprehensive about the outcomes. But it does transcend not just the Pashtun community, but the other major ethnic communities in the country. And President Karzai is clearly reflecting public opinion when he endorses these prospects. My own view is that peace negotiations are worth pursuing even if they fail. I think the risks for the Taliban and for the insurgency are much greater than the risks for the government and for NATO and the United States. They're fighting a jihad, a holy war. And it's much more difficult for them to justify both talking and fighting at the same time than it is for us. The Karzai government, the U.S. are fighting for representative government in Afghanistan, and the people want a peace negotiation, and it's perfectly consistent with the overall mission of both NATO and the Afghan government to give them what they want and to make a genuine try. I do think that there is a reasonable prospect that negotiations could succeed in delivering what I suggested was America's bottom line objective, which is to prevent Afghanistan from again becoming not just a sanctuary for al-Qaeda, but an ally with al-Qaeda, and that should be the bottom line objective of the United States in any such negotiations. But negotiations can only succeed if they don't have to succeed. Negotiations can only succeed if one has a viable alternative to success. And that means that in this case, the United States has to be preparing for two different futures. One in which negotiations succeed, and as a component of that negotiation, the U.S. agrees to withdraw its forces. And there are a number of other components of the agreement as well. The alternative is no success. A situation in which the Afghan civil war continues more or less indefinitely into the future. And in order to achieve the U.S. objective, the United States is going to have to be engaged to some extent. It's perfectly reasonable, coming back to the issue of costs, to do a cost-benefit analysis on Afghanistan and to determine that maybe the costs of preserving an Afghanistan that's not an ally with al-Qaeda is too high, and that we'd be better off cutting our costs and accepting higher risks. What's not really acceptable is to suggest, I think, that you can cut the costs and still not increase the risks. People have talked about moving from a counterinsurgency to a counterterrorism strategy on the arguments that that would be much less resource intensive. But you can't conduct a counter-terrorist strategy in Afghanistan if the country's are governed by the Taliban. And that means that in order to conduct a counterterrorism strategy, somebody else has to win the counterinsurgency strategy. That is, they have to prevent the Taliban from taking over the government. So if you're more confident that Karzai can do a better job here than we can, fine, then advocate that we move only to counterterrorism. But if you have some doubts about that, then moving in a more deliberate pace, as indeed the administration intends, to transfer these responsibilities is appropriate. So again, we need to prepare for two very different futures, and we need to make both of them credible. We need to make negotiations credible by making clear that we are prepared to withdraw under the right conditions, and we need to make negotiations persuasive to the other side by making equally clear that we're prepared to stay.
My role in this conference is sort of like Joel Grey in Cabaret, to jump in whenever I need to, and Susan Glasser is wonderful. I wanted just to say, as I neglected, I want to shower with thanks and praise Christine Fair, who's joining us from UC Berkeley. Christine is Assistant Professor at Center for Peace and Security Studies at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, author of Drone Wars, the article very provocative and important that recently appeared in Foreign Policy. I've been advised by our tech people, Christine, that while you speak, which if Susan Glasser encourages you to do, while you're speaking, just turn down the volume and it will cut down the feedback on your own computer. But now I turn it back to Susan.
Do you want her to go now?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, Christine, we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts as well on what are actual realistic options for proceeding at this point. Can you hear us?
Yeah, actually, is the audio okay? Because I hear there's just a lot of static on my connection.
Can you turn down the volume?
I'm trying to do that now.
I should be able to do it here.
Is that better?
A little bit more. A little bit more. It might be us, so we're gonna work on it.
Is that okay?
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. I have this Jurassic netbook. I'm surprised it even works. It's a little better than a carrier pigeon.
Okay, we're
So,
good. We're good now.
Okay, so we're good now. So I mean, obviously I've missed a good chunk of the portion because I was actually trying to sleep. So I have a little bit of concern that some of my points might be redundant. And I don't know the extent to which you guys had already spoken about the Pakistan issue, but this has been one of my longstanding critiques of expanding the counterinsurgency effort in Afghanistan has been because of the absolute impossibility of engaging Pakistan on this issue. In several conversations over the last few weeks surrounding the Raymond Davis issue and Pasha's visit, you once again hear this discussion of the so-called trust deficit. And I have always been critical of this construction. I remain so, because what strikes me is that this isn't a trust deficit. This is actually a certitude surplus. Right? Pakistanis understand that as we're trying to get an end state in Afghanistan figured out, that the space that we used to have to finagle important differences is really constricting. And so to put a fine point on that, our needs to go after the Haqqani network, obviously the Quetta Shora, which has now been relocated to Kurram, Karachi, and elsewhere, and Pakistan's desire and indeed requirement to maintain these assets are really coming into sharp conflict. And over the last 10 years or so, what we've largely done is we've tried to finesse this. That yes, it's true that Pakistan and the United States, we have different strategic goals over some longer term time horizon, but on issues, for example, like Al-Qaeda, the Pakistanis are going to help us out. What has become increasingly clear over the last year or so is that Pakistan is trying to figure out a completely separate endgame in Afghanistan. Of course, they've always done this. But I think we would be behooved to try to understand what it is the Pakistanis are discerning, because I think it does reflect some of the conversations I picked up on the last 2 minutes of the previous speaker. I think was that Jim Dobbins?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. It sounded like you, but all I see is some dude in a purple tie and a beard sitting in front of me. So one thing I've noticed in my
No, she can't see us.
sorry, dude. One thing that I've noticed in the last year or so of my several trips to Pakistan is that the Pakistanis themselves are very worried about the remnants of the so-called Afghan Taliban, right? So one of the consequences of U.S. and NATO successful efforts at eliminating these different levels of leadership is that they've had to be replaced very quickly. And the people that are coming in to fill those billets hate the ISI, quite frankly, as much as they hate us. They have a different relationship with the ISI than the Al-Qaeda commanders of 10 years ago. They see Pakistan's role in Afghanistan as being manipulative, serving Pakistan's interests, but not that of Afghans. And so the Pakistanis themselves are trying to figure out, how do we regain the momentum, how do we regain control over this organization that has really evolved over the last 10 years, right? It's not the same organization that it was 10 years ago. So the very fact that Pakistan itself is scrambling to figure out its own end state about this organization, does strongly suggest that our strategies about thinking about the Taliban really need to change. And I think fundamentally, one of my biggest concerns about the expansion of the counterinsurgency effort really goes back to Pakistan, right? The more troops that we need to have on the ground there means that we're ever more dependent upon Pakistan, not less. And so these differences that were significant, but somehow finessable over the last 10 years have become much more difficult to finesse. And I'd like to add that, of course, it's no longer just issues around Al-Qaeda and the Taliban that we're very concerned about with Pakistan. We're also very concerned about Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? I mean, I don't know how much you guys have talked about the multiple security concerns that we have situated there in Pakistan, but there is this enormous irony from my point of view that we've chosen a strategy that says we need to stabilize Afghanistan so we can stabilize Pakistan, but in fact it's just the opposite. Whatever happens in Afghanistan is going to be to a very significant degree overdetermined by Pakistan itself. Right? That's my view. If you were to put your Pakistani goggles on for a second, since 9/11, its security equities have compromised more than they have been buttressed. So, for example, under the U.S. security umbrella, the Indians have been able to develop a presence in Afghanistan that they weren't able to develop before we were there. And so this gives rise to some, I think, a difference between what the Pakistanis say publicly and what they actually say privately. I know Kiani has said repeatedly, you need to have reassurance that you're going to be in Afghanistan in perpetuity. The White House somehow believes that by staying in Afghanistan, we're going to reassure the Pakistanis. It's actually just the opposite. I've been working with the Pakistan Army for a very long time now and spent quite a bit of time with a lot of them over the summer. I'm going back this summer. What's absolutely clear is that no matter what Kiani says, this is the way that many of the people that I've interacted with, including folks at the major level, they want us out. And they want us out for the reason that I just said. The longer we stay, the longer the Indians can basically free ride under our security umbrella, when in fact they simply want the Indians gone. So I see a huge number of discontinuities between our goals in Afghanistan and what we can accomplish when we consider what we're able to do with the Pakistanis. And I think at some point this last decade, wishful thinking about how we can bring the Pakistanis on board to get them to Seth Jones and I, a bunch of us have worked on how do you fundamentally reshape Pakistan's cost-benefit calculus around its current programs. And the approach the U.S. has adopted thus far, which is really about financial allurements, strategic conventional weapon systems, none of these things are adequate to convince Pakistan that its current approach is anything but helpful. So at what point do we really have to reconsider what we want to do and what we can do in Afghanistan when we have a more realistic understanding of what Pakistan is and will be, rather than the Pakistan that we aspire or hope to obtain through these various allurements? And so, going back to the theme of this, I've actually been a fairly strong proponent of this thing. I mean, a number of people have put it forward, Vice President Biden. I think there's a lot of merits to the counterterrorism plus notion. And I apologize, I didn't hear all of Dobbin's critique of it. But let me put out on the table why I think there's some advantages to this, although in some sense this train sailed, where we are where we are. By having a more easily sustainable footprint in Afghanistan, where we're not completely dependent upon Pakistan for the GLOCs, we're able to create a space where we can play more, we can play a harder ball game with Pakistan than we can right now. I'm not convinced that we cannot continue to go after Al-Qaeda without our counterinsurgency footprint for the following reasons. And we know that what's going on right now is a negotiation about a SOFA, a status of forces agreement. Karzai has no interest, and I can't imagine, let's start from a fundamental assumption. I think it's a low probability event, given even the abysmal operational capacity of the ANSF, that a return to the Taliban central government is even realistic. I take this off the table. So if you're it's a genuine possibility of the Taliban coming back, then my analysis it is absolutely pointless. So I'm going to take as a given that we're not going to have, Taliban 10.0, running the country from Kabul. So if we put that extreme outcome on the table, this is what I think could possibly work. Karzai has no interest in Al Qaeda coming back, and this we have fairly tightly aligned set of interest, right? So we negotiate through the process of the SOFA access to a number of important military bases from which we can continue to prosecute the counterterrorism mission, focusing on Al Qaeda. Now, I don't know, how much you guys talked about this before, but I am very strongly of the view that no matter how horrible the Taliban are, there is such enormous variation in the Taliban that it's very hard for me to say that the Taliban are any worse than some of the savages that we've made as our allies. So I find the moral arguments against the Taliban to be thoroughly unconvincing. And given that so many Afghans are opposed to the counterinsurgency, I'm also not convinced that once or if we were to scale back a counterinsurgency footprint, that our intelligence doesn't actually improve. So one of the arguments for maintaining the status quo or even escalating the counterinsurgency footprint is the quality of intelligence. I think it's a fairly specious argument to say that through our current operations we're getting, excessively high quality intelligence. I'm not persuaded by that. So, just sort of in conclusion, in making the defense for the counterterrorism plus, by getting out of a footprint that Afghans themselves seem to find so odious, and finding some midpoint of tolerance with the Taliban, I think it's entirely possible that our intelligence on Al Qaeda actually improves. And just in closing, I think realigning what our priorities in Afghanistan that focuses on Al Qaeda, not the Taliban, not only allows us to be in a less intense confrontation with Pakistan so that we can pursue our other objectives, which I think are far more important in Pakistan, frankly, than they are in Afghanistan. But ultimately, this becomes much more finessable in terms of money, lives, and the sorts of things that populations in Afghanistan, the United States, and Pakistan are willing to tolerate.
Christine, thank you so much. I know we can't see you, but we are very grateful for your provocative comments, and in fact, I'm hoping we can get as quickly as possible to a conversation among this great group. I'm going to ask Brian to go next, and actually, Brian, if you could talk from the podium, I think that will be better for our C-SPAN viewers.
Great.
But if we can keep it tight, we'll have more time to debate and discuss as well as get your questions.
Great. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Stephen, and everybody who's come here today, because I think this is a very important event. The first panel, I think, really punched above its weight. It had a lot of expertise, but it, I think, offered new ideas about how we can address this challenge. And what Joshua Faust called the malarkey of tragic horses. I see it as a classic Humpty Dumpty problem, and I was thinking about this event this morning and thinking about all of the think tank reports that came out last fall, in particular, including my organizations, the Center for New American Security, a bipartisan commission on the Council on Foreign Relations task force, New America's Afghanistan Study Group, and other. If you look at the broad contours of what's proposed in there's a lot that's quite similar amongst those recommendations. And a lot that's not new. And what I hope this conversation, I think, does is pushes us forward in this policy challenge that I think this administration is wrestling with. But it's clear to me at this stage, nearly 10 years into this war, we still lack a coherent strategy. We still lack a coherent strategy that sticks together. And I was thinking about this and why is this the case? And at the risk of being pedantic before I get to the where do we go from here, I think it's important, I do this a lot in meetings in the government too. What is a strategy? It includes a statement of objectives and desired ends. Those ends need to be realistic and achievable and well-defined. There needs to be ways and means designed to achieve those ends. They need to be prioritized in importance. And the roles and responsibilities of key players in executing those ways and means must be clearly defined. That's a very basic, I think, definition that we often miss inside of government and also in the think tank community, where we have the luxury of thinking about things as opposed to doing and clearing the inbox of those inside the government. I think there are three main reasons as to why 10 years into a war we still lack a strategy. And this is very basic, but I think it's important to think about and maybe provoke new thinking on this. Number one, there's a multiplicity of actors that have a stake in the outcome. Christine's comments just talked about this, looking at it from the Pakistani perspective as opposed to ours. But number one, there's a number of different actors that have different interests, and we need to digest that here inside the Beltway, understand that yes, our interests matter, have a clearly defined goal for those to advance those interests, but others are operating in that way. We quite often don't do that. We quite often don't map out what are the strategic interests of other actors. We often don't know in some cases because of the opaqueness of this. Number two, there's a wide range of complicated actions that each of these actors are undertaking. So to assess what's going on, I think you get a sense of complexity. And you understand why we're in somewhat of a quagmire. Number three, and I think this is important for the DC discussion, there is a considerable gap between America's impression of itself and our capacity to achieve stated outcomes. And it's not only in Afghanistan or Pakistan. I work on the Middle East also, and nearly for the last decade or so, we have had presidents of the United States, President Bush and now President Obama, declare certain outcomes they want to achieve, and then we don't achieve them. And it has created what I call an efficacy crisis. And this debate about the decline of American power, which I don't completely accept, because I actually think there's something deeper going on. I think that the nature of power in the international arena is actually changing. What it means to actually get what you want done. And that there's a multiplicity of actors that can shape that. And people have written about this more theoretically. That said, what do we do on Afghanistan? 6 quick things, and I'm going to go through very quickly, I hope. Number one, I actually think we need to continue to question counterinsurgency doctrine, which has continued to dominate a lot of our decisions. We did this yesterday in a great discussion with John Noggle at CNAS over at the Center for American Progress yesterday. It's my view that the doctrine has important elements and principles that can be applied in certain situations, but we need to stop thinking about it like a strategy. And I know I'm going to get tweets and angry blogs just for stating this, because it's almost become like a dogma. And if you question it, it's really, you're like questioning a religion. But the long war, as it's called, and counterinsurgency aspires to be like containment and deterrence was in the Cold War. It cannot be thus, because the seeds of a counterinsurgency strategy applied globally are it destroys itself, essentially. It is not sustainable for a number of reasons. Number one, large number of troops are not cost effective. Richard talked about that before. Number two, the presence of foreign troops quite often creates security challenges that didn't exist before. It inflames local populations. Number three, I think we see this, there's a potential legitimacy crisis of political actors that we seek to support in counterinsurgency strategies. And then number four, this is the thing that concerns me the most, it erodes potentially U.S. will to project its power in the world in different ways. That I believe we need to be a global leader, but I think we're eroding the political will on Capitol Hill to use resources to remain a global power. So number one, we need to question that. Number two, I think we need to have a goal, a clearly defined goal. Disrupt, dismantle, defeat Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan is the goal as articulated by the president. That is fine as far as it goes in terms of trying to marshal public domestic political support. But I think it also doesn't get us to much clarity in terms of what we're trying to build and achieve on the ground. I state the goal often as a stable and peaceful region of the world, South Asia, that is much more integrated with itself and economically, politically, culturally. You need to have a broad goal like that and state it proactively as opposed to in the negative, which our current goal is to disrupt, dismantle, defeat Al-Qaeda without defining what are the conditions that we need to get there. Two, I think we need to identify that which we're going to do and that which what we're not going to do. We need to check our American exceptionalism at the door, in a sense. And this is going to be the hardest thing to do. And I'm trying to be a little bit provocative here, but we can't do it all. That runs against the grain of American culture, but we simply cannot do that a lot of things. And we're going to keep running in circles, I think, in Afghanistan if we don't recognize that. The last three things. We need to identify not only the interests of actors, but what they can do and what they're already doing. I think James in the last panel talked about statecraft. There are many faces here who have decades of experience who are engaged in statecraft and understand this. Ambassador Dobbins, Ambassador Pickering, who was here before. Understanding what I've talked about and Steve mentioned, that getting others to paint the fence for you, getting others to pull their weight, understanding what their interests and what they're doing right now to achieve that which you want to achieve. Because right now, it's all about us, and a good bit of it, we're bearing the burden, and I don't think we fully understand how to disentangle ourselves.
Number 5, we need to identify multiple means to achieve those goals and not simply be focused on troop levels. And again, we're going to go into another round of debate here. And I'm sure it's going to be about the slope of the pace of withdrawal of U.S. troops. That's an important debate. But the thing that frustrated me in the fall of '09 when I came back from Afghanistan is that there was insufficient debate about the political and economic means that are available, not only to the United States, but to other countries. People haven't noticed the Defense Authorization Act, Ike Skelton, 2011. Not many people notice this, even in the policy discussion. It actually requires the President of the United States and the Pentagon and the State Department to produce a viable economic plan for Afghanistan that is sustainable. We in the think tank, I was doing a poll of think tankers. They don't know, a lot of people don't know that. People on the inside need help with that. This is one of the most. And then lastly, I think we need, this is probably the most controversial thing, we probably need a healthy dose of strategic ambiguity and flexibility in our own policy. This is anathema, I think, to a lot of people who want certainty. They want a deadline to get out, or they want to stay indefinitely in a long-term agreement. And here I'll only highlight 2 very specific things. Christine briefly mentioned this. I think it's quite foolish at this point for President Karzai to have the impression that we need a strategic framework agreement, strategic partnership agreement, more than he needs it. And I think that's the impression that our current action is leaving right now. With all due respect to President Karzai and his government, he is the leader of a relatively weak, poor, and corrupt government, and he has run circles around us for 5 or 6 years. And we've allowed him to do that, our own actions, our own sort of American exceptionalism, we've got to get it right, the sunk costs, yada, yada, yada. Number 2, on Pakistan. What was the phrase? The certitude surplus. That's brilliant, Christine. It's really, really important. I think at a certain point, there is a great deal of utility in having a strategy that has some elements of strategic ambiguity, that leaves some questions in the minds, because oftentimes our debate in the Beltway is, how do we reassure everybody? How do we reassure everybody that we're going to be with them in the long run? And what I'm saying is that we've got a considerable amount of power that is, in a way, like judo or jiu-jitsu, used against us, like the weapons, the resources that we're using to try to achieve certain ends, because we are so bullish about trying to get to where we want to go without thinking about what others can do to paint the fence for us. So I know I went over, but I hope that sparks some new thinking. I have some specifics in the questions and answers, but I look forward to the other respondents on the panel. Thank you.
Excellent. Brian, thanks so much. I can see but by the end of this, we're going to have to be taking a vote here on counterinsurgency and whether it's actually a religion or not. Peter, I think we're very much looking forward to your sense and injecting also a little bit of your thoughts about what's really realistic in terms of what we're talking about here, in terms of the U.S. military's footprint in Afghanistan. Is it going to be changing in the foreseeable future? How much of this is continuing a conversation that we've actually been having for quite some time?
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Steve Clemens, and for the invitation and to be on this great panel. Just a few factual points about some things that have been said earlier today. In terms of a cost-benefit ratio, at the height of the Vietnam War, the United States spent 9.5% of its GDP on the military. Right now, we're spending 1% of our GDP in Afghanistan. So we weren't attacked from Vietnam. We were attacked from Afghanistan. I think the money's worth it. And of course, the money will go down as we draw down. In a $15 trillion economy, $118 billion or whatever it is a serious amount of money, but it's not really a game changer in terms of our debt and other issues. In terms of painting the fence that Brian mentioned, there are 46 countries in Afghanistan as part of a coalition. And in fact, British and Canadian and Danish troops have died at a proportionately higher rate if you adjust for population than for Americans. I wanted to sort of attach myself to many of the points that Jim Dobbins made in terms of the data, and there's one data point that I'd like to add to that, which is you're more likely to be murdered in Washington, D.C. today than you are to be killed in the Afghan war. The war in Afghanistan simply isn't that violent, certainly by Afghan historical standards, and by absolute standards. You're 6 times more likely to be killed in New Orleans, murdered in New Orleans today than you are to be killed in the war in Afghanistan, where 2,800 civilians died last year. But it's when you adjust it for population, you're still, as Jim mentioned, more likely to be killed in Iraq. And one final point on the counterterrorism coin debate. We've already tried the counterterrorism approach and it was found wanting. And the whole point about where we are today is we did this whole exercise on the cheap. As Jim Dobbins and others at RAND pointed out, in the first years of the Afghan project, we spent roughly a 30th of what we spent in Bosnia after the conflict there per capita, and of what we spent in Kosovo. So, we did it on the cheap, and that's why we're here today having this conversation. Why are we there is an interesting question. I think the President has made a mistake, a very understandable one, about narrowly defining it just about al-Qaeda, which of course, from a political view, makes a lot of sense, because which American wants al-Qaeda to be back in Afghanistan? The answer is none. But there are some other reasons, one of which is a very unrealistic one in foreign policy terms, which I think, and many Afghans think, that we have sort of a moral obligation to get it right in Afghanistan, by right, a somewhat stable state, a somewhat okay army, before we leave. And I think that's a reasonable thing for us to consider now that we've overthrown their government. And it's not just al-Qaeda we need to be concerned about. When Afghanistan was ruled by the Taliban, every Muslim insurgent terrorist group in the world was either headquartered there or had a significant presence there. So just to define it merely as al-Qaeda is not enough. And then, as Brian pointed out, a stable South Asia is surely a part of this picture. And finally, the Taliban are the Taliban. The idea that somehow these are going to turn into sort of a group of Henry Kissingers over time, I think is just ludicrous. We've run a controlled experiment on this issue for years in Pakistan. In Pakistan, in Swat, just 2 years ago, they beheaded the policemen, they burned down the girls' schools, they imposed a reign of terror. That's the Taliban. The Taliban don't recognize the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Haqqani network today is hosting not just al-Qaeda, but Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, the Islamic Jihad Union. I can give you a whole multiple set of three-letter jihadist groups that are now located inside the Haqqani network. This is who they are. And what are they doing in Afghanistan? As Jim mentioned, 2,800 civilians were killed last year, 75% by the Taliban. There's been a consistent campaign, by the way, not very well covered in the American press, in my view, of chemical weapons attacks against girls' schools, which have happened all over the country in Afghanistan, more than a dozen cases. So that is the Taliban. That said, of course, we do want to reconcile with people, even people we find to be morally objectionable in one way or another. But there are several problems with reconciliation I just want to tick off very rapidly. One is we're